All right. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. My name is Ben Almassi, and the subject of our session today is my book, Reparative Environmental Justice in a World of Wounds, published in December 2020 by Lexington Books. So first things first, shameless plug. If you're inspired to pick up a copy of the book or to ask your library to purchase it, you can use offer code LEX30, AUTH20 to get 30% off either the ebook or the hardcover version. Okay, shameless plug concluded. With us today are our two critics, Dr. Karen Emmerman, joining us from the West Coast in Washington State, and Dr. Barrett Emerick, joining us from the East Coast in Maryland. Before I turn things over to them, let me take a moment to set things up. This is a book about the possibilities and practices of reparative environmental justice in the moral aftermath of environmental injustice and other environmental wrongdoings. Now, ideally, we wouldn't do each other wrong or other members of our biotic community, but we have and still do, rampantly, extensively so. So how can we repair our human and biotic relationships damaged by environmental racism, climate change, animal exploitation, and ecological destruction in other forms? And how does reparative justice look different when we go beyond narrowly construed human conflicts to include relational repair with ecosystems, other animals, and future generations? To try to answer these questions, I build on theories of justice in political philosophy, feminist ethics, indigenous studies, and criminal justice, but extended and applied to non-ideal environmental contexts. All right, that's enough for me. Our first critic today is Dr. Barrett Emerick, and I will turn things over to him.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today and to get to engage with Ben Almassi's Reparative Environmental Justice in a World of Wounds. This is a rich and important book, and to my mind, one that's been much needed for a long time. For me, the single most notable thing in Almassi's approach is that he starts with non-ideal circumstances. After wrongdoing has occurred, after environmental damage has been inflicted, after environmental racism has already become entrenched in social relationships, and then asks the forward-looking question of how we ought to proceed. Where should we go from here, given that we don't have a blank slate? This fundamental commitment is one that I share. This non-ideal methodology geared towards moral repair or restorative justice asks the crucial question so often overlooked by Western moral philosophy of how to make things better in a world whose history has rung up an incalculable moral debt for which reparation is owed. Bringing that framework and orientation to bear on environmental issues is therefore of real value. With all that said, I do have some concerns for whether Almassi's project can accomplish all that he intends. In other words, I want the project to succeed and raise these concerns genuinely hoping that Almassi can dispatch with them. And it's in that spirit that I'll proceed. I'm going to raise two main concerns. The first is whether the restorative, reparative justice framework on which Almassi relies can apply in the ways that he wants it to. The second is whether the project is too hopeful, too optimistic about the possibilities for success. So first, Almassi says that in contrast with retributive or restitutive approaches, restorative justice and reparative justice focus primarily on the relationships between victims, offenders and their communities, relationships damaged or destroyed by wrongdoing. In particular, Almassi relies on Margaret Walker's view that our aim should be to, quote, move relationships in the direction of becoming morally adequate. Both Walker and Almassi are right to frame our goal in terms of moral adequacy. Though restoration and repair are backward-looking, in the sense that they're grounded in a wrong or injustice, they're also forward-looking in that they don't necessarily set turning back the clock, undoing the wrong or the injustice as if it never occurred, as their aim. This is crucial for at least two reasons. To do otherwise would fail to take note of the needs of victims of wrongdoing, and some wrongs can't in fact be undone. I'll return to the second point in a few minutes, but now I want to focus on the first. Why wouldn't we set as our aim unsaying a hurtful word, undoing the damage that we've caused, so that we can go back to the way that things were? One reason why is that in many cases, the victim of wrongdoing doesn't want things back the way they were. That might be because the relationship prior to the wrongdoing was itself harmful or toxic. Or even if it wasn't, there are some wrongs that give rise to the desire not to be a part of each other's lives anymore. Since reparative and restorative justice take as a central guiding tenet that they should prioritize the experience, perspective, and needs of victims, creating space to defer to those needs is crucial. So even though it's easy to use the language of turning back the clock, that shouldn't be our approach. Instead, it should be about achieving moral adequacy in the relationship between the parties. That language itself can sometimes cause us to slide into thinking as if wrongful actions can be undone, since relationships seem to imply active and ongoing presence in each other's lives. An example of what the alternative looks like might help here. So imagine a case of a bitter divorce grounded in infidelity. The person who cheated is deeply remorseful and would take it back if they could. The person who was cheated on has no interest in maintaining the marriage or even of ever speaking again. Walker and Almassi tell us that moral repair can still be achieved in such a situation. The relationship can still be made morally adequate while respecting the desires of the wronged party to have the relationship end. This can be accomplished via reparative efforts made by the wrongdoer. In this case, it would likely mean feeling remorseful, recognizing the nature of the wrong and the ways in which the victim was harmed, and apologizing sincerely. The victim then might accept the apology and forgive the wrongdoer. Then they might go their separate ways. Even after years of not speaking, so they're not actively in each other's lives, they are still in moral relationship with each other, insofar as they were once married, one person cheated and then apologized, and the other forgave, but the relationship ended. In other words, they remain in moral relationship with each other insofar as we can describe how their stories came together and then parted ways. They are now each other's exes, and that shared history helps to identify them today in a way that can be morally adequate. Almassi wants to take this approach and apply it to new groups of morally considerable others, asking us to think about ways to apply the standard of moral adequacy in a relationship to future humans, whole social groups of humans who are victims of environmental injustice, non-human animals, non-sentient life, and to macro objects like a forest or a landscape or a shoreline. And it's here that I worry that the standard of moral adequacy breaks down. So what does it mean to respect the experiences, perspective, needs, or desires of a victim of wrongdoing if that victim has died, doesn't yet exist, or has no subjective perspective, desires, or needs? For instance, if a corporate polluter damages a shoreline, killing much of the plant and animal life, and poisoning the water supply for humans living nearby, and disrupting the ecosystem for years or decades, what does it mean to make the relationship morally adequate? And moreover, which relationships are to be made morally adequate? Between whom do those relationships obtain? Is it the head of the corporation who serves as representative, the particular person who made the call that resulted in the damage and death, the corporation as an entity? Who are or what are owed reparation? The particular sentient animals that were killed and presumably suffered along the way? The humans whose water was poisoned? The larger biotic community as a whole? The shoreline as an entity that stands over and above the rest of its constituent parts? These questions are familiar and tricky for anyone engaging with representative apology, in which wrongdoing is not easily traced to the actions of a single responsible agent, or when victims are diffuse, or when there's a corporate body made up by multiple victims who might disagree about whether reparation has been made. To be clear, Almassi is familiar with and begins to address such questions, cashing them out in terms of our ability to identify victims. In other words, he's dealt with this type of concern before. Nonetheless, I still want to invite him to try to provide more clarity about just what the nuts and bolts of his framework look like in cases like the one I've described. Then I want to press the point a bit further and ask for yet more clarification about how we're to evaluate moral adequacy in the relationship in such a complicated case, especially since the shoreline itself, the land and the water, has no needs, nor a subjective perspective in the way that the sentient animals who were killed did. In other words, I'm unclear about what moral adequacy means in such a scenario. Now, I suspect Almassi might want to make use of an appeal to environmental ethical pluralism, as he does in reply to Emerick Katz, who's raised objections similar to those that I'm developing here. Almassi's move is to recognize that there are a variety of different environmental ethical approaches that one might adopt. For instance, an anthropocentric focus on environmental racism might zoom in and focus just on the cost to humans, whereas those who adopt a theological environmental ethic might focus on ways to reach a morally adequate relationship with God or the divine. I don't doubt that those different approaches will in fact reach different conclusions about how to construe what moral adequacy involves and within which relationships it obtains. However, I'm skeptical that this appeal to pluralism actually responds to the objection rather than simply sidestepping it. In particular, Almassi says that, quote, environmental holists may adopt suitably holistic versions of reparative environmental justice, such that restored habitats are themselves viewed as party to restored ecological ethical relationships, and practices of ecological repair are directed toward not only individual human or non-human animals, but also to the ecosystems of which these individuals and groups are part. The problem is then to figure out, for those who want to take the idea that the land itself can be wronged, what it means to think that the corresponding reparative obligations could be satisfied on the grounds that those duties did not aim to turn back the clock or simply undo damage, but to make the relationship morally adequate. In what sense is the corporate polluter in a relationship with the land? Recall that in the divorce case, the two ex-spouses remain partly identified by each other. Years later, they're able to look back and say that they were once married, that the one who cheated acted wrongly, then worked to make amends, and the wronged party chose to accept those efforts and to forgive. In the pollution case, from a more holistic environmental ethic, most of those features are impossible. The land isn't able to forgive. It doesn't have reparative needs that could be satisfied, and indeed it can't look back on and identify with the relationship as it was or make the comparison to how it is now. Because it lacks the ability to weave such elements into its own narrative, because it doesn't have a subjective perspective in the first place from which to construct such a narrative, I'm doubtful that Walker's standard of moral adequacy can ever be met when dealing with anything that lacks some degree of sentience. Note that it's not enough here just to appeal to the attitude or efforts made unilaterally by the corporate polluter. To see why, return to the divorce case once more. Let's say that the spouse who cheats again feels genuine remorse, acknowledges that they acted wrongly, commits to acting differently in the future, and apologizes sincerely. If those efforts are not grounded in dialogue, or at least understanding of the perspective and needs of their spouse whom they wronged, I don't think we've met the standard of moral adequacy. Not only is it the case that the spouse chooses not to forgive, but what's so crucial to Walker's account is that the needs and perspective of the victim are central to the reparative process. So if the wronged party isn't a part of it, if it's unilateral, we should think that the relationship has not achieved moral adequacy. Returning now to the polluted shoreline, it seems to me that the reparative efforts of the corporate polluter, even if well-intentioned and sincere, will always be unilateral, and so will always fail to achieve the high bar of moral adequacy that Walker sets and that Almassi endorses. So this is all a way of saying that I remain unconvinced, though I want to be convinced, that a reparative, restorative approach really is compatible with a non-anthropocentric environmental ethic, or perhaps more to the point, with an environmental ethic that doesn't have a subject at its center with whom one might stand in moral relationship, like God or the divine in a theistic account. Continuing to develop that admittedly dour point is that I'm also unconvinced of Almassi's optimism, that as many of the world's wounds can in fact be repaired as he suggests, though again, I hope to be convinced. In his fruitful engagement with Katz about the possibility of wilderness restoration, Almassi grants that some damage might be irreparable, if the victims no longer exist, for instance. But he then follows up both by saying that Katz's acceptance of the impossibility of repair is too widespread, since many other victims of wrongdoing or injustice exist, and so can be the targets of reparative effort. I think this reply is too quick and runs the risk of erasing the wrongs that have been committed, the damage that's been done. To be clear, I don't take Almassi himself to be wanting to paper over that damage, but I do think that responding to Katz's objection that many environmental harms are irreparable by pointing to the many that are merely sidesteps the concern. As an alternative, I want to suggest that part of what humans should do as beings who've caused profound and catastrophic damage to the natural world, a massive amount of which seems to be irreparable, is to think more about the role that grief and mourning should play in our reparative practices. Here, I suggest that one fruitful way forward might be to rely on Elizabeth Spellman's book, Repair, as a way of acknowledging that our impulse to fix or rebuild ruins often runs roughshod over what's before us, which is the impossibility of such efforts. So not everything that's broken should be repaired, and not every possible opportunity to try to repair should be taken. I'm thinking, for instance, of the last two white rhinos in the world, a mother and daughter living in a wildlife reserve in Kenya. Their species lies in ruins due to innumerable wrongful actions. What do humans owe to those two rhinos in particular? They seem to be living a good life, unaware that they're the last of their kind. What do we owe to their species more generally? I think I'm with Katz and Spellman here in thinking that there is no morally adequate state of the relationship to work towards. There is no way to repair what's been broken. Instead, we should work to live with our grief, and we should grieve of the destruction of the species and the many, many others that are not so charismatic as to catch our attention. I'm of the view that much of environmental ethics in the Anthropocene should take on the task of reckoning with the damage we've wrought and developing new understandings of how to do so. That's a huge and painful problem to take on, and one that I often struggle with in my own life and teaching. I would welcome Almassi's insight here and conclude by inviting him to say more about how his approach helps us to engage in that reckoning and in that grieving. Thank you very much.
Barrett, thank you so much. We'll turn now to our second critic, and then after they've both had a chance to speak, I'll say a little bit in response. So our second critic today is Dr. Karen Emmerman.
Thanks so much. I'll first say I find myself wishing that this session were called something more congenial than author meets critics. Something like author meets fellow travelers who wish to think along with him would be more apt. I'm grateful to Ben for writing this important book. It's a timely and tremendously important book undertaken with great care, allyship, and humility. It's an honor and a privilege to get to think along with Ben about these issues so near and dear to me. And I thank him for the opportunity to have this discussion and for giving me a chance to meet and think along with Barrett as well. I'm going to focus my questions on two main areas. First, second order harms that come about through the reparative process. And second, complications related to trust and forgiveness in the interspecies and intergenerational reparative realms. So let's start with the first, the second order harms brought about through the reparative process. So Ben, you thoughtfully point out at various moments in the book that reparative processes, while meant to restore relationships of trust, can themselves go awry, thereby creating new occurrences of wrongdoing and harm. You note that these second order harms can manifest epistemologically as when perpetrators require or request that marginalized people they have wronged undertake the work of explaining their situation, their point of view, or positionality to facilitate reparative work. These second-order harms can also occur when the work of reparative environmental justice itself involves wrongdoing or causing harm to sentient creatures, as in the case of the Chicago wilderness ecological restoration requiring the culling of deer. It seems to me that these sorts of second-order harms will unfortunately be more often the rule than the exception, given the deeply entangled nature of systemic injustice, speciesism, naturism, and other pernicious conceptual frameworks that have led to the degradation and exploitation we now seek to repair. So not surprisingly, given my own work on interspecies moral repair, I'm on board with the importance of thinking about environmental wrongdoing in terms of reparative rather than compensatory justice. I also recognize that throughout the book, you make clear your view that reparative environmental justice is messy, it's complicated, inappropriate in some settings, and given the complexity of systems of domination and oppression, extremely challenging in practice. So I asked the following question in the spirit of wanting to hear you say a bit more about practical application and the intersection of wrongdoings, and not because I think you are unattuned to these complexities. You are profoundly attuned, which is why hearing you say more would be so valuable. So let's start with considering the lake sturgeon example you raise in chapter 3. In the lake sturgeon example, you describe the restoration in relational terms. The Little River Band of Ottawa Indians see the restoration as bringing back their fish ancestors and restoring the group's relationship with the fish. Additionally, settler colonialists and local tribes see the restoration as part of repairing damaged human relationships. This is, as you note, an important reparative effort, given the long-standing and horrific array of wrongdoing by settler colonialists and their ancestors towards Indigenous people of North America. And yet, this particular reparative environmental undertaking involves another sentient being, the lake sturgeon, one who Greta Gard, in talking about the similar setting of cultural whaling, notes is not a member of the human community at all. So in this practical example of reparative environmental justice, we confront at least two intersecting possibilities for causing second-order harms in the reparative process. First, if this reparative restoration effort involves returning lake sturgeon to Big Manistee River watershed to then be fished and eaten, then the reparative work harms the fish. Second, in making claims regarding the first concern, we risk reifying epistemological and ontological wrongdoing towards marginalized people. So here we're confronted with significant practical challenges. Regarding the first second-order harm to the fish, the profoundly complicated nature of reparative environmental work that involves using sentient creatures who cannot be a party to reparative deliberations is highlighted. While the humans involved may see the fish as a way to repair relationships between groups of humans and between humans and fish, we can't lose sight of the absence of fish subjectivity in these discussions. They cannot swim themselves up to the table and join deliberations. Thus, we must rely on humans to present their needs and interests. Not all those who speak on behalf of non-human animals' subjectivity are trustworthy. And given rampant speciesism, we must be wary of human agendas infiltrating the presentation of non-humans' subjectivities. It seems to me it's reasonable to think the lake sturgeon are being harmed in this reparative effort, adding a new set of victims to those historically wronged. Regarding the second-order harm, we encounter an intersecting practical challenge involving the question of how diverse epistemologies and the call to rectify wrongdoings with respect to traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous ontologies complicates reparative efforts. So again, the lake sturgeon restoration was seen both as reparative of the relationship between people, settler Americans and the Anishinaabe people in the region, and by the tribes as repairing relationships between some humans themselves and non-humans, the fish. Efforts by those concerned about second-order harms to the fish risk their interspecies advocacy committing epistemic and ontological harms to the indigenous people of the region, who, from what you have written, have a very different conception of relationality with fish than most Western animal advocates. By advocating for the lake sturgeon and asking questions about their use as tools for human reparative endeavors, we risk adding additional human victims of epistemological and ontological harms to those historically wronged. The victims of second-order harms brought about by reparative environmental efforts in this case seem to be piling up. And I'm reminded of the constant refrain of my father, a first responder, who said all the time, the first rule of rescue is no new victims. So though reparative environmental justice may not share this dictate of rescue, it seems relevant to thinking about the practicalities of undertaking reparative efforts. I worry that the promising nature of reparative environmental justice is so complicated by these competing values, and the various parties may endlessly circle one another without ever finding a place to land. Alternatively, they may land in a place that perpetuates the objectification and exploitation of non-humans who are at a distinct disadvantage insofar as they cannot represent themselves in reparative deliberations. I find these complications worrying in the interspecies realm, for it's here that we humans, on all sides of environmental wrongdoing, perpetrator and victim alike, might be operating from epistemologies and ontologies that are speciesist in nature. So I'm hoping you can share your thoughts on the two issues I raised here. First, how should we think about and approach second-order harms to sentient creatures in the reparative process in a context where the animals are unable to represent their own subjectivities? And second, how do we move forward, or indeed should we move forward, with reparative environmental justice efforts when its very undertaking involves potentially causing multiple intersecting second-order harms? How many victims is too many? So I'll move on now to my second question regarding trustworthiness and forgiveness. In discussing the challenges of using the concepts of trust and forgiveness in an intergenerational setting, in particular with respect to reparative justice related to climate change, you opt for an approach that lets go of the expectation that perpetrators involved in reparative work will be able to know they have been forgiven, or that trust has been reestablished satisfactorily from the perspective of victims. In other words, because of the complex nature of intergenerational repair, you argue that the typically central role trust and forgiveness play in reparative justice must be reconsidered. We perpetrators might just have to let go of ever knowing if we've achieved those ends. And I agree with you that this option seems preferable to the others you explored, for example, having a less literal and more interpretive conception of forgiveness. I find myself wondering, however, why this isn't the approach you take in the interspecies realm. So in discussing trust and forgiveness in cases of interspecies, you note that one complication is that some non-human animals may not have sufficient cognitive capacity or complexity for concepts of trust and forgiveness to apply to them. Rather than jettison trust and forgiveness in all interspecies cases, you instead opt for a solution where they are called for, and here I'm quoting you, just in case the particular interspecies relationships and non-human victims' subjectivities allow for trust and forgiveness. That's the end of the quote. If I understand you correctly, this means that in cases where animals are capable of trust and forgiveness, those should be elements of reparative work, assuming trust is appropriate, because as you know, trust won't always be appropriate or desirable in interspecies repair. In cases where animals are not capable of trust and forgiveness, we do not consider them part of our reparative endeavors, instead focusing on other elements of repair. I would think, though, that the approach you took with respect to trust and forgiveness in the intergenerational setting would be preferable here for several reasons. First, though it is likely the case that some non-human animals might not have the cognitive capacities necessary for trust and forgiveness, it is highly doubtful they have the capability to discern who has and does not have those capacities. Humans may not be smart enough to know how smart animals are. I'm skeptical then that we will know which cases of interspecies repair require elements of trust and forgiveness and which do not. I'm also concerned that your approach opens the door to committing epistemological wrongdoing inasmuch as we fail to accurately assess animals' subjectivities. Second, it's not clear to me that humans can reliably know whether we are seeing trust and forgiveness or something else when we interpret animals' behaviors. This is not to say that I do not think some animals are capable of trust and forgiveness. I certainly do. I also think there are cases where those who know animals very well, are deeply engaged with them, know them as individuals, may be able to accurately identify their behavior as manifesting trust and forgiveness. However, there is a real danger of human perpetrators projecting our desires for trust and forgiveness onto animal others to assuage our own feelings of guilt and shame. One regret I have about my paper on sanctuaries is the suggestion I made that the chimpanzees I met at a sanctuary had demonstrated forgiveness. As Patrice Jones pointed out to me, they very well may not have forgiven us humans for the wrong perpetrated against them during their time as subjects in biomedical research. I've come to wonder over the years if the chimpanzees do not forgive us at all. Perhaps they show what looks like trust and forgiveness to their caregivers because they must to survive. Perhaps their choices are merely forward-looking and make no commentary on the past. Put another way, reparative relationships in the interspecies realms are complicated in part by the continued nature of the dependence the animals have on us humans in some situations, and in others by the power wielded by humans to control the contours of reparative efforts. Maybe those chimpanzees would relish the chance to bash a human over the head with something heavy as payback, but we'll never know. Because of our safety, for our safety and theirs, repair requires that we withhold opportunities for that kind of free expression. Perhaps what looks like full trust to us is actually what you call therapeutic trust in the interhuman reparative realm, a courageous effort on the part of animal victims to make themselves vulnerable and voice their needs so that perpetrators or caregivers of the same species as the perpetrators can show ourselves worthy of trust. Perhaps their seemingly trusting gestures are simply tests to see how we will treat them. Perhaps what we call trust is just them having few or no alternatives. You can't bite the hand that feeds you, and they know this. It may not then be full trust at all that we are seeing, despite our hopes that it is. My worry is that we are neither epistemically privileged enough to know who in the non-human animal kingdom is capable of trust and forgiveness, nor epistemically humble enough to know for sure whether what we are seeing is trust and forgiveness in the cases where that capacity exists. With those concerns in mind, would it make sense to go with your approach in the intergenerational setting and say that we should work towards trust and forgiveness in the interspecies setting with the understanding that we likely will never know whether we have achieved those ends? There may even be a kind of justice in this, where perpetrators of violence, exploitation, and consumption of animals are denied the kind of solace afforded by knowing with certainty that one has been forgiven or that one is trusted. This perpetual undercurrent of discomfort, of never knowing whether we have reached repair from their perspective, could be a crucial element in forcing us to rethink the practices that bring us to the need for repair in the first place. I have many other questions and thoughts I'd love to hear from you about regarding your wonderful project, but I will defer those to another time. So thanks so much for inviting me to this discussion, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Karen, thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. So I'll say just a little bit in response. Hopefully it's useful, but the exhortation, the encouragement that both of you are giving me to think more about these things, I can't pretend that I'll achieve that today, but hopefully I can start to make some headway on it. Okay, so Barrett has two major concerns. The first is whether the framework I'm using can really be used in the way I want to use it. And the second is whether my project is too hopeful about the prospects for success. I totally agree that our aim should not be to turn back the clock, and I really appreciate Barrett's reminder that a major reason not to think of things this way is that in many cases, victims of wrongdoing don't want things to go back to how they once were. And Barrett is right to say that whatever is going on in repairing our relationship with the land, it can't just be about perpetrators' attitudes or unilaterally made efforts. That's right. This is about relational repair rather than, say, remediation of a wrongdoer's character, though there could be some overlap there. And he's so right to encourage us, and me in particular, to attend more to grief and mourning in the aftermath of environmental wrongdoing. And here I'm reminded of Julia Gibson's recent work on climate justice for the dead and dying, including how memorials figure into that. And part of what Gibson reminds us is that grieving and memorializing are themselves in need of ethical evaluation. So, for example, why are we grieving? And why are we doing it in the way that we are? I would say that in Barrett's example of the corporate polluter who damages a shoreline, there are many relationships here that have been damaged by this environmental destruction, many different human and non-human victims, and many individual and corporate agents who bear some responsibility. And some of those relationships can be repaired and others not. And that sure does get messy. Speaking for myself personally, I'm not sure whether a shoreline or the water are members of the biotic community owed relational repair. But the approach to reparative environmental justice that I'm trying to articulate in this book shouldn't turn on my specific beliefs about who or what warrants moral consideration. I'd like for it to be useful for a range of environmental philosophies, including those held by people who take themselves to be in moral community with a river or a lake. So, what does reparative justice look like? What guides it in cases where the victims of environmental wrongdoing aren't just a human or non-human animal taken individually or collectively, but an entity that lacks sentience, that lacks a subjective perspective? That is a great question, yes. And I wouldn't be surprised if some folks decide that ecosystems, while instrumentally important, can't be victims themselves of environmental wrongdoing because they lack those necessary features. Such folks will not take themselves to stand in moral relationship to ecosystems themselves, only in relationship with the human and perhaps non-human creatures that call such ecosystems home. For those who do see an ecosystem as itself wronged by our destruction and degradation, and so in need of relational repair, what would restored moral adequacy look like? Just to reiterate, that is a really good challenge. And I can only begin to respond, which is to say this. This is a big part of why I'm excited about 21st century ecological restoration, particularly 21st century approaches to ecological restoration that join together scientific and traditional ecological knowledge in the way that, say, Robin Kimmerer explores in her work. The Society for Ecological Restoration, the flagship society for this practice, has moved away from reconstructing historically authentic ecological configurations as the goal of restoration, and now focuses instead on facilitating the recovery of a degraded site's ecological health. Now, this is not the end of the conversation, but I do think facilitating recovery of a degraded site's ecological health is a promising way to pursue moral adequacy in repairing one's relationship with the site in question. What counts as ecological health is its own fascinating question. But whatever it is, it's definitely not just putting things back as they were. And beyond that, making sense of ecological health as a measure of moral adequacy is one more opportunity for fruitful and, yes, difficult exchange between ecologists and philosophers, among others. So, turning to Karen's comments. Karen points us towards the challenge of interspecies repair and the place of trust and forgiveness in such processes. She walks us through the issue and then quite plausibly interprets my position this way. So just a little quote. In cases where animals are not capable of trust and forgiveness, we don't consider them part of our reparative endeavors, instead focusing on other elements of repair, unquote. I think that's totally a plausible gloss, but this isn't actually what I have in mind. Instead, I'd say that where animals are not capable of trust and forgiveness, or where trust might actually be inappropriate, given the sort of human-animal relationship we're talking about, we should still pursue interspecies repair. It's just that that reparative process won't involve trust and forgiveness. Instead, we ask the more general question, what do these animals need to restore or create more adequate moral relationality with humans and the rest of the biotic community of which we're part? Now, I realize that in the absence of rebuilding trust and extending forgiveness as markers of relational repair, the stuff of this sort of reparative process becomes even more mysterious. I think Karen is right to worry that we're fallible about knowing which animals are and aren't capable of trust and forgiveness. And relatedly, I'd say that we're also fallible about knowing when human, non-human relationships ought to involve trust and when not. I also think she's right to remind us of our fallibility and the very real biases we bring to assessing animals' forgiveness or lack thereof. And I absolutely welcome her suggestion that we should work towards non-human animals' forgiveness when forgiveness is an appropriate goal, without necessarily being able to know whether we have in fact been forgiven. Karen reminds us that the possibility for second-order harms looms over the reparative process itself. And I suppose I think of environmental relational repair like Annette Beyer talks about trust. It's important and worthy of philosophical analysis, but that doesn't mean it's always a good thing or without its own moral pitfalls. Now, harms that result from environmental relational repair aren't always morally wrong, so consider the lake sturgeon example. As oceanographic efforts to restore sturgeon populations in Michigan succeed, some sturgeon will experience harm through natural predation or other non-human causes. But what Karen's worried about here is different from that. She's worried that even as this stewardship program helps repair the relationship between Anishinaabe and white settler community members, the sturgeon themselves are treated instrumentally, just a mere means towards human reparative ends. And if this program were directed by settler colonialist values, I would be more worried about that too. But as Marty Holtgren and his co-authors describe the Anishinaabe sturgeon restoration efforts, the sturgeon are recognized relationally rather than instrumentally, core members of the community rather than resources. And what's going on isn't restocking a fish population for easier fishing, but the sturgeon filling key ecological roles. So as Holtgren tells it, the sturgeon restoration program helps repair the human relationships, but it's not because like white Michiganders are like grateful to have more fish to fish, although we could easily imagine that. It's other ways. So for example, white people come to appreciate the Anishinaabes' ecological knowledge, seeing them as more than just quote unquote a casino tribe. Holtgren describes how each year, each September, hundreds of community members, native and settler alike, come together to participate in this ritual of releasing young sturgeon into the Big Manistee River. I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that a person could support and participate in the sturgeon stewardship program as relational repair without necessarily supporting and participating in fishing them. Now, it is true that traditionally Anishinaabe cultures have understood eating the lake sturgeon as a part, though definitely not the only part, of healthy relationality with them. Now, you might challenge that, but you could challenge it while still supporting the lake sturgeon restoration program as good for the people, for the fish, and the Big Manistee River ecosystem. I think that I'm going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for those who are able to attend today, for those who are watching after the fact, and thanks especially to our two critics, Barrett Emerick and Karen Emmerman.